Tim Bourret, though, knows all about the rivalry that really, for a lot of us, especially guys my age, born in 1977, I mean, this was sort of the paramount game on Clemson's schedule for a multitude of years. For me, Tim Bourret joins us here on the program today. Tim, welcome in. Hope you're doing well.
Doing great, Lawton. How you doing? I'm not at Myrtle Beach today. I'm actually just outside the Clemson football practice facility. I went to check in a little practice today.
Well, I know they're scheduled to come off the practice fields in about 28 minutes or so we won't keep you too long. I'm interested to hear the feedback, but this game between Clemson and Georgia, Kelly Gramlich was on earlier, and she said, and I think it's an interesting way to put it, this is sort of the talk of college football right now, and as good as Clemson's been at the beginning of the season to be in a game that's the talk of college football is still pretty substantial.
Yeah, it is. It does take me back to some other Clemson Georgia games where that was kind of the case. I mean, just back in 2013, you had a battle of top 10 teams, and that was the opening Saturday night on the Saturday night primetime game. And, you might remember that is the best presentation of running down the hill that I have seen. Bill Bunnell allotted 6 minutes of the pregame to show that, and did just a terrific job in presenting that, multiple cameras. I mean, he prepared for that back in June. He first called me to get some permission from Dabo to put a camera on the bus and some cameras in other places.
Well, and that game and that moment under the lights sort of brought back and carried the ambiance of what this series once was, but I think for a lot of people. But it's so strange because I was saying, I have a nephew that was born in 1991. And so in his life, these two teams have only played, 6 times, I think. And now this will be the 7th time. So there's a part of me, and it maybe kind of exists in you, that maybe this younger generation only holds on to this because we tell them they should.
Yeah, you and I lived through the great era of this rivalry. Of course, was 77 to 87. The teams were 5-5-1 against each other. There were close games. There were upset. They were all close. In fact, the 9 games that Coach Ford went against Coach Dooley, it was 4-4-1. And the total points scored were 153 for Georgia and 152 for Clemson. That's how close those games were. I did get an interesting about, look back at that 82 game, of course, was a matchup of the last 2 national champions. It was broadcast on Monday. It was the Monday night football game before the NFL season started, 9:00 primetime start. And I believe it was only number 7 versus number 11. Believe it or not, you would think the 2 national champions would have gotten a little bit more respect from the AP voters going into that game. And if you had the last 2 national champions today playing, it'd be a top 2 or top 3 matchup, or like we're seeing in this game, 2 top 5 teams. But there were a lot of defensive struggles when the 2 teams met in the 80s. That game in 1982, Georgia won 13-7, didn't score an offensive touchdown. The only touchdown of the game was, scored by Georgia, was a block punt. Clemson scored out a touchdown pass, I believe, from Homer Jordan, and then they had 2 Kevin Butler. No, it was Rex Robinson. It was Rex Robinson, I think, field goals, and they won 13-7.
You mentioned how tight that series was during that time, and you bring up those games. Now, because of your role as the SID at Clemson and now being retired but still being around the facilities, I mean, I know we can find some of these games on YouTube, but is there an archive? I mean, can you go somewhere and watch any of these games? Are they all on tape somewhere around the campus?
A lot. Well, I don't know about around the campus, but you're right. I haven't really. I know Rick Bagby's probably got them all in his archives. And if you go on YouTube and just type in Clemson versus Georgia 1986, that game will come up. Same thing will come up I watched the 83 game recently because I wanted to see how long the 2 field goals were that concluded the game. You might remember that game ended up in a 16-16 tie with, I think Clemson attempted a 66-yard field goal and Georgia a 68-yard field goal in the last 2 plays of the game. I've watched the 1981 game has been is up on YouTube, so you can see a lot of them.
Man, I tell you that archive and to be able to get in and watch some of those, and I know there've been some guys that are Clemson fans that have certainly put those up. And I just had to wonder, like, is there this master control room where you guys can sneak away and go watch any old Clemson game that most of us, the common folks like myself, can't get our hands on anymore? But
well, yeah, I don't know if it's stuff you can't get your hands on, but yeah, Rick Bagby's got a great supply in his office, and it's actually on a server that they have with all the videos that they have in the library for Clemson. I don't think the 1978 game is up there, although there's probably some video that was used for the highlight film at the end of that year. Same with 1976. 77.
Tim Bourret with us here on a Thursday afternoon. So, Tim, you mentioned that matchup with the back-to-back field goals. I think you said 83, and that's one that's always been unique to me because I've never seen that before or since that I'm aware of. Maybe it's happened. But field goal kickers were such a key to this series, whether it be Kevin Butler, whether it be David Treadwell. I mean, when you look back on it, you talked about how competitive they were, but I mean, they were tight. I mean, down to the wire, safety field goal to win it. I mean, there were a lot of those where it just was came down to the last tick off the clock.
That's right. And, from a Clemson standpoint, one game I'll always remember is the 1984 game, a game that Clemson went to Athens, ranked number 2 in the country. We were on probation that year, and a lot of people thought if we could win that game, we could run the table and maybe win the national championship. We had a 20-6 lead at the half, and then we had some turnovers, and Georgia went ahead 26-23 on a 60-yard field goal by Kevin Butler. That was just an amazing kick. It wasn't really close. He made it by a good 5 yards. Game with 11 seconds left, and the part of it they don't remember is that on the ensuing kickoff, Coach Ford called a trick play in which Ray Williams took the kickoff, ran up the right side, stopped, and threw the ball over across the field to Terrence Rulak. Terrence Rulak then ran the ball over midfield. He wasn't going to go all the way for a touchdown, but he was run out of bounds. Let's see if I can remember the yard. Anyway, the bottom line is he was run out of bounds, and then there was a flag for a late hit on Georgia. Now, had the penalty gone through, Donald Igwebuike would have had a 42-yard field goal to tie the game. But the referees, after a long consultation, ruled that the personal foul had taken place after the game was over. Now,
that's brutal.
Well, play's a play, and sure, the tackle took place out of bounds, but I actually have had a stopwatch on it, and it only took 9 seconds before he was run out of bounds. So there still should have been 2 seconds on the clock, but of course they didn't have replay in those days. And so Igwebuike, who was 17 for 18 on field goals, by the way, that season did not get an attempt to tie the game, and Georgia won 26-23.
Oh, I know that's one that certainly still probably eats at Coach Ford when he looks back at it, knowing that there still should have been some time left in that ball game. And that kind of brings me to my next question about Coach Ford and Coach Dooley, their relationship. I mean, we know of the stories. Most of us have heard stories about the recruitment of Herschel Walker and all of those things. But, when it gets down to who those two guys, are as far as competitors, what were they like at that time going head to head?
Well, yeah, they kind of had the same philosophy of being successful in running the ball. When Georgia won the national championship to beat Notre Dame in the Sugar Bowl, I think they only completed 2 passes. I think Buck Bellew only completed 2 passes the entire game, and it was all about the ground game, and they had terrific, ground attacks. And Coach Ford maybe threw the ball a little bit more than Coach Dooley, but he was kind of similar. The goal for Coach Ford was to run the ball for 250 yards a game, and if you get to 100 yards passing, well, so be it. But they won the game with a strong kicking game, very good defense, and a good rushing attack. It was all about run the ball on offense and stop the run on defense. So they were very similar in their approach. Of course, in the 1980s, there were a lot of coaches that had that approach. You look at the success that Oklahoma and Nebraska had during that time, and it was the same way. The only school that were seen to win national championships by throwing the ball during the 80s was Miami.
You bring up an interesting point, Tim. You mentioned Oklahoma and Nebraska, and that makes me think about the national rivalries at that time and the way this game was so competitive with teams that had won national titles. I mean, again, to try to get you to rank all the great rivalries that were going on at that time, but in my mind, I would think it would have been bigger than, say, what Florida State and Florida would eventually become, or Florida and Miami. I mean, where in your mind was Clemson, Georgia, by comparison to, say, Michigan and Ohio State, that Nebraska-Oklahoma matchup? I mean, was it a top 5 kind of rivalry in your opinion, just kind of given the, what those two teams were doing at that time?
Yeah, I think it definitely, you had to say it was in the 80s, especially when you look at the two programs won back-to-back national championships. Now, the great games between the two teams started in 1977, but I can't say that going into the 77 game there was a lot of hype about the game because Clemson was coming off a 3-6-2 season. But when Clemson won that game in Athens 7-6, that was a landmark game because at the time Clemson had not been to a bowl game since 1959, and that victory really catapulted Clemson to a good bowl season in 77, and then of course in 78. The only loss that year was to the University of Georgia by the odd score of 12-0. When you look at the offensive personnel in the Clemson team, I believe 6 guys on offense went on to start in the NFL. Although Dwight Clark played in that game, little inside baseball to show you how things have changed. Dwight Clark actually got a photo pass from Al Adams at the Orange and White, and since he couldn't play because of a shoulder problem, he actually took pictures for the Orange and White during that game. I don't know that Al Adams ever printed any of them, but I do remember that being the case in 1978. But getting back to your overall question, I really think it was a top 5 rivalry. Right there at the beginning of the 80s and through 1987, when the two teams didn't play for a couple of years in 88 and 89. We kind of played Florida State as a replacement in those 2 years. But, the game was on national television in 82, 85, 86, 87. So the fact that, they wanted that game on national television tells you it was quite a rivalry.
Legendary Clemson SID Tim Bourret hanging out with us here today. A couple more questions for you on this front. And then I want to reset just back on the second one. But the fan bases, right? I mean, these are two fairly rural schools in the South. There's not, Athens is obviously bigger than Clemson at this time. And even I'm assuming back then it was the same. But I mean, how much of that weighed into the rivalry, that these people looked an awful lot like you, but they wore the wrong colors? Like, how much was that a part of it as well?
Yeah, I think the bottom line, Lawton, is both schools really cared about football. Football was important, and it's always been important at Clemson. We still had good crowds, even when Clemson wasn't very good between 1960 and 1976. But obviously, that is the biggest factor, that the two programs, their fan bases, really cared about the program, and it led to some really legendary atmospheres, whether you were in Death Valley or you were down in Sanford Stadium.
We mentioned earlier, Tim, about how there's sort of been a bit of a gap since, I guess, 1991, really the last time after they kind of played fairly consecutively. But was there something specific that happened, around 16 or so, when you start to see these two teams not playing all that much after playing an awful lot in the early 1900s? I mean, was there a rift? Was it just the scheduling deal? I mean, being so close together, it's hard for me to believe how few times they played from 1917 to 1961.
Yeah, the games were kind of sporadic. I believe Clemson won in 1955 here, and they did start coming back in the 60s. There was the famous game with the hail in 1964 here at Clemson. But no, I'm not really aware of a reason why it was so sporadic in that time period that you said. But now Clemson played in the Southern Intercollegiate Athletic Conference. I'm not sure that Georgia was. I don't think Georgia was in the conference. It kind of goes with when they joined the SEC. So they probably had some stricter rules about scheduling in that time, or games they had to schedule within the Southeastern Conference, which I think started in 22 maybe?
Somewhere in that range, yeah. The old Southern Collegiate whatever athletic conference with like 32 members or whatever the number ended up being. That's what I go to whenever people talk about mega conferences. I say we had that. We had that a long time ago.
Way back, yes. Southern Conference was about that big too.
So I hold on to that. Well, Tim, thank you. Best of luck over there at the press conference today. I'll be tuned in as well to hopefully bring some of that to our listeners here on the show, and certainly look forward to getting up with you next week. It'll be game week. It's unbelievable.
Game week. Yep, looking forward to it.
Yes, sir. Tim, take care. Tim Bourret, legendary Clemson SID here on the show that shakes the Southland. All right, that was fun. Listen to that now. How close, and this is what I was saying earlier.